Our guilty pleasure this quarantine has been watching old seasons of Survivor. Nikki and I watched the first few seasons that aired, but it's been a long time since we've watched it, and our children have never seen it. So very often in the evening, we'll sit down and watch an episode or two, and we find great joy in watching this group of 16 or 20 people dropped off to a remote location where they have absolutely nothing. They have one pair of clothes. They don't have any food. They don't have any shelter. They can't drink the water unless they boil it. And they'll be lucky if they have a couple of instruments where they can actually go out and gather some food. And we find it enjoyable. I know that's a horrible thing to say, but we find it enjoyable because we are sitting easy and comfortable on our couches watching them struggle. And we know that just a week before they landed on those locations, most of them were living the easy life as well. Because that's what our culture is. And that's what we like. We like things easy and instant. Think about the internet. It makes gaining vast amounts of information easy and instant. Our cell phones make communication easy and instant. Things like Amazon Prime, where you can literally get anything within a day or two to be delivered on your front door. It makes shipping and purchasing so easy and instant. That's the culture we live in, and that culture has many benefits to it, but it also brings about some problems. And it brings about some problems when it impacts our Christianity. It impacts our Christianity because we want a Christianity that is easy and instant. We want a Jesus who will bless the things that we normally do and just say, you're all good. Just keep going as you are or as you want. You know, Protestantism was made for the easy and instant Christian life. The early proclamation of Protestantism was faith alone, that our relationship with God through Jesus Christ is simply based upon faith in Jesus Christ alone. So if we simply trust in Jesus, then we are a part of God's people, and that's all we need to do. There is much truth to that theology, but perhaps the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction. And this is exactly Dietrich Bonhoeffer's concern in his book, The Cost of Discipleship. He's concerned about what he calls cheap grace. In fact, he thinks cheap grace is the most dangerous thing impacting the church today. In a quote that's not in your devotional, Bonhoeffer says, "The word of cheap grace has been the ruin of more Christians than any commandment of works." Remember Martin Luther during the 16th century? He rebelled against what he considered to be a commandment of works. He rebelled against this idea that we had to follow a certain set of rules and laws and rituals in order to earn favor with God. And that's why in reading the Apostle Paul and the New Testament, he realized that the New Testament speaks of our salvation by God's grace through faith alone. And what an important corrective that was to legalism. But Bonhoeffer is concerned that the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction. It swung so far in the opposite direction that we've started to live this idea of cheap grace. In the devotional today, there's an important line where he defines cheap grace. He says, cheap grace means justification of sin, but not of the sinner. The Reformation really brought back this understanding of justification. And justification is the idea that we are declared righteous in God's sight, that we are forgiven and declared righteous and holy, even though we're not really righteous and holy. And Bonhoeffer wants to say that is theologically correct, but we have to read the New Testament in greater detail. Because justification of sin, being declared forgiven and righteous, always includes the justification of the sinner. That is, through the work of the Holy Spirit, we will actually become what God has declared us to be. Through faith, God has declared us to be righteous and holy in his sight. Through a work of the Holy Spirit, what we call sanctification, we actually become that, and our lives are transformed. Bonhoeffer considers it cheap grace when we only focus on being forgiven, but never experience any transformation towards Christ likeness. Let me give you some modern day symptoms of cheap grace. I wore my Ohio State 2019 Big Ten Champions shirt today for this purpose, because you might think of cheap grace like being a fair weather fan. You know, it's easy to be a fan when your team is winning. It's easy to be a fan and to wear your team's colors when everything is going well. It's hard to be a fan when they're losing all the time. It's hard to be loyal to your coach. It's hard to be loyal to your players when they just can't seem to do anything right. It's been a good decade or two for Ohio State, but the first decade that Nikki and I lived in Michigan, we were 1-9-1 against the University of Michigan in football. And it was hard. It was hard to be an Ohio State fan. It was hard to wear my colors in the state of Michigan because Michigan just beat up on us year after year. Cheap grace would be abandoning my team until things go good again. It would be not sticking with my team during the difficult times. Well, there's symptoms of cheap grace that impact our Christianity. When we go to church and say, I've done my Jesus thing for the week, and I'll do it again in another 7 days, that's a symptom of cheap grace. When we say a prayer of salvation and we say, Jesus, I trust you for the forgiveness of sins, and think that we're good for the rest of our lives, no matter how we live, that's a symptom of cheap grace. When we know a few things about the Bible, maybe when we memorize and can quote a couple of Bible verses, we're impressed with our knowledge and we think God is impressed with us as well. But our relationship with God goes no further than that. That's a symptom of cheap grace. You can see cheap grace all over the American church today. And unfortunately, pastors and churches like to promote cheap grace. Why? Because it caters to our easy and instant culture. And if churches and pastors can just make Jesus easy and instant, if we can just make Christianity easy and instant, then we will attract lots of people, because that's what we want. We don't want to make following Jesus sound too hard. We don't want to talk about obedience too much. We don't want to talk about holiness, because that'll drive people away. When we have that mentality, we've fallen in to cheap grace. Bonhoeffer's warning today and tomorrow is to avoid cheap grace because, as he says, it's the mortal enemy of our church. Rather, Bonhoeffer says, our struggle today is for costly grace, because costly grace is the way of Christ, and costly grace is what we'll talk about on Friday.